All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I'm going to kick us off. My name is Betsy Robley, and I'm the Conservation and Advocacy Director here at the Mountaineers. And we have the honor of welcoming Jason Vogel tonight. This is the third and final presentation of our climate change speaker series. And this is a series that's sponsored by our Carbon Footprint Reduction Committee. And this committee was created to help the Mountaineers reduce our organization's carbon footprint, which was one of the goals of our Vision 2022 strategic plan. And this committee has been doing some really amazing work over the past 2 years, from installing solar panels on the roof of our Seattle Program Center to making our program centers and lodges more energy efficient, and educating our community about ways that individual Mountaineers can reduce their impact on the environment. So the goal of this series is to continue that education and help our community learn more about the climate crisis from a variety of perspectives. And tonight we're excited to welcome back Jason, who gave this presentation at the 2019 Mountaineers Leadership Conference and returns to share this information with a wider audience. Jason will discuss what the science tells us about what will happen to our beloved Pacific Northwest landscapes and some of his thoughts on what the Mountaineers can do to make a difference. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few short housekeeping items. I want to call your attention to the fact that this Zoom presentation is being recorded so that we can send the recording out to everyone afterwards. And second, we ask that you keep yourself muted with your video off the whole time. We will have time for a short Q&A after Jason's presentation, which will be facilitated by our fantastic Mountaineers volunteer, Natalie Oaktebake. You can submit a question using the chat box. Natalie will be monitoring the chat box and will pose your questions directly to Jason. You're welcome to submit questions at any time during the presentation. You can feel free to chat and say hello to folks. And if you've joined us for our series so far, thank you so much for your participation and your interest. We'd love to hear from you with any feedback or input about how the Mountaineers can continue to engage our community about the climate crisis. So that is it for me. And now I'd like to hand it over to Natalie.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third event in the Climate Change Speaker Series. I'm Natalie Oaktebake, and I've been working with Betsy Robley and the Carbon Footprint Reduction Committee to organize these lectures for the Mountaineers in Tacoma. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Jason Vogel, who's the Deputy Director of the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group, and he's also our fellow Mountaineers member. Jason Vogel is a scientist and a project manager with significant global expertise in studying climate adaptation and resilience. He started with his degrees in chemistry and humanities from UT Austin, and from Texas he moved on to the University of Colorado at Boulder, where he earned his Master's of Science in Astrophysical, Planetary, and Atmospheric Sciences, and a PhD in Environmental Studies. He spent several years at a place called Stratus Consulting in Boulder, leading a team that studied climate change vulnerability for the US Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory. He also led a project to integrate climate impacts into the USAID's guiding documents, and he investigated how climate change would influence international investment and development in the Caribbean. He next spent 4 years at ABT Associates in Boulder, working on how Central Asian nations could adopt climate resilient development strategies that would be in line with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I was interested to see that that was drafted in 1992, almost 30 years ago now. Jason moved to our region in June of 2019 to join the Climate Impacts Group, or CIG, at the UW. It's a unit focused on applied research related to climate and communities. So if you go to the CIG website, you'll find a variety of active studies that are underway in the Pacific Northwest, involving our coastlines, wildfire and precipitation projections, species like the marble murrelet, salmon, sage grouse, Forests, erosion, flood risk, you name it, they're working on it. And so it's an incredibly interesting and necessary, vital unit right now. So thanks again for being with us here tonight. I'm now going to turn it over to Jason Vogel, who will talk to us about climate change in the PNW, what's happening, what's going to happen, and what to do about it. Thank you for being here, Jason.
Thank you, Natalie and Betsy. I really appreciate the introduction. Let me just share my screen here and get things started. I'm super excited to be here and speak with everyone tonight because in addition to my career working on climate change, I've been a lifelong passionate outdoorsman, recreationist, conservationist. There's so many ways to spin it, but you know, I'm one of us, and so I like speaking to my people, and that's why I'm super excited to speak to you all today. Normally, when I give a talk like this, I like to kind of get people engaged, so it's not this one like a lecture format where you're just listening the entire time. Not as easy to do over Zoom, but I will ask you to contribute some stuff into the chat box in a couple of spots. So that'll be an invitation. You don't have to do it, but just to try and you know, spark a little conversation. It's the next best thing we can think of. And so today I'll talk to you about climate change in the Pacific Northwest, what's happening, meaning we've already observed it, what's going to happen. Those are the projections of what the science says is going to happen. Most importantly, and I like to emphasize this one, it's what to do about it. And I really feel like many of these talks that fail to get what to do about it. In fact, Roger Mellum, you probably need to. I can hear you through me. There we go. Thank you so much. All right, so let's talk about climate change. So this is like, you know, a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I feel like a lot of people feel this way, pretty honestly, right? Like, let's talk about climate change. They just want to ignore it. There's nothing I can do about it. It's too big of a problem to tackle. It's the end of the world as we know it. There's a lot of reasons to feel a lot of anxiety, trepidation. And my hope is that we can help to normalize this conversation. So I want to talk about it with you. And I'm hoping by talking about it with you, you can see that it actually is something that's worth talking about. And once we normalize that conversation, that's the most important thing we can do, all of us, to actually facilitate action, is to normalize the conversation and just for this to be something we talk about on a daily basis. So quickly, we'll do introductions. I just got introduced in depth, so I may skip through this pretty quickly, but we're going to start with you all. This will be my first time with the awkward hi. I'm going to ask you to quickly type into the chat, if you're willing, these, you know, answers to these 4 questions, if you will, just who you are, your passion, what has made you become a volunteer for the Mountaineers, why are you attending a talk on climate change, or what really concerns you about climate change, and fourth, when's the last time you actually had a conversation with somebody in your regular daily life about conversation, and how did that conversation go? So that's a lot to type out in the chat box. But I want to talk a little bit about myself, and that'll give you some time to talk about yourself and actually maybe make some connections and get to know some of the other folks that were interested in this talk. So who am I? In addition to all of the long list of accolades and where I've worked and whatnot, really what I've been working on climate change, mostly impacts and adaptation. So not how do you stop burning fossil fuels, but really more what do you do about the changes that are coming down the road, for about 20 years now. And I've worked with a range of organizations, starting with, you know, like your local water utility, and literally that might be your local water utility depending on where you're calling in from, because I have worked with Seattle Public Utilities, but a lot of water utilities in other locations. They were some of the first people that really got concerned about climate change. But then, you know, working the whole gamut and doing that international development work. And what I really learned was that a lot of people have a lot of questions about climate change, and they're curious, and they it kind of touches so many different elements of people's lives. And so I'm really excited to be able to come here today and see how that interacts with each of y'all's lives. But what was I going to say there? I think I missed something. I'm working without notes here, so give me a little grace in my stumbling around. I wanted to say on this slide that in addition to being a scientist and getting involved with climate change, I've also been a lifelong outdoorsman. I started as a kid. I'm actually sitting in my parents' home right now, and this is kind of where I fell in love with the outdoors. And some of that was as simple as just down the street, I would cross what was a major road at the time, and there was an empty lot, and we would just play in the woods, and that kind of got me started. And there was backpacking trips that came out of that, Boy Scouts, family camping trips, you name it. I imagine you all have similar stories. But the reality is that, recreation really touched my life and gave me that appreciation for the natural world and the outdoors that persists to this day. But, as I got older, that desire for adventure really grew. I wanted to do more interesting things, go to more remote locations, and just experience everything that nature had to offer. But that really was enough. Just having adventures made me want to share that love of the outdoors with others. And I'm sure many of you, since you're on this call, had a similar experience where you decided to get involved. So I had a couple of experiences getting involved. One was, these were both in Boulder, Colorado, where I moved from about 18 months ago. And I got involved with the local trails organization, and land. It was sort of like the main interface with land managers was the Boulder Mountain Bike Alliance. And I just felt compelled to work with land managers, to talk with elected officials, to organize volunteers, and create community around the outdoors. And I really feel like there's something about being an outdoors person that crosses party lines, that really allows you to connect at a visceral level and have meaningful conversations. And one of those conversations I think we should be having is around climate change. So, what I'm saying here is that when you really think about it, conservation and recreation are intrinsically linked. I just put, 3 examples up here that kind of play that story out for me. Ducks Unlimited, I'm sure some of you know this story, and for those who don't, Ducks Unlimited was founded in 1937, and since then, they've raised over $3.5 billion and put it towards conservation initiatives. This is probably the world's most successful conservation success story. And it is a story that revolves around people that like to hunt ducks, right? That's kind of a little weird maybe, but I think it speaks to the passion that people bring to their recreational activities and how it can literally change the face of the planet. Protect Our Winters is another organization I wanted to highlight, just because they were founded about 14 years ago, but they were founded specifically to work on the topic of climate change. And in the course of 14 years, they've gone from just, a couple of people with a cool idea to an organization that's linking business leaders in the outdoor industry with elite athletes, across all sort of sports, but Olympic athletes, and turning them into advocates that are pushing for policies I can't remember necessarily all 4 of their major policy foci, but it's electrifying vehicles, it's pushing for a carbon pricing scheme, preventing natural gas and oil leasing on public lands. And there's a 4th pillar that I'm missing, but they've really focused in on some very specific things to help tackle the climate crisis. And but they're really motivated by their love of the outdoors. That's what drives that organization. And of course, the Mountaineers, I've got us up on there as well. And, the Mountaineers has been around for, I think, 115 years now. And that longevity has played out. People know who the Mountaineers are. They respect the work that's been done. Many of us have volunteered for the organization and to bring other people into that love of the outdoors for a whole host of reasons. And I hope by the end of this talk, you're probably already there. One of those reasons is to help tackle the climate crisis. And I always like to, whenever I can, throw this Margaret Mead quote into a presentation, because I just feel that it's so powerful. And even though you can read it yourself, so I'm going to read it out loud. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And I've certainly experienced that in my life. And I take that with me. I hope you take it with you as well. And kind of, a piece of this puzzle that I want to just emphasize is it doesn't matter if you shop at REI or at Cabela's. There's something about being an outdoors person that speaks across party lines. It speaks across, stereotypical social barriers, and really allows us to connect with people in a really meaningful way. So enough with the intro and the pep talk. Let's get down to the science. I'm going to tackle the science in two sections. This first section, what's happening. These are observed changes, things we've already seen. The next section will be on the projections. What do the models tell us is going to happen? So let's start with what we've seen. First is temperatures in Washington state. So we know that the temperatures have been getting warmer. This is a graph that shows you that trend, and what you can see is that there's a lot of seasonal variability. Like some years are warmer, some are cooler. Oh, and this is average winter temperatures. So January through December average temperatures. This is where we see the biggest change in Washington state, but it's changing across all seasons and in all geographies across the state. But the purple line that's going up and down, that shows you your sort of year-to-year variability. You have hot years, you have cool years. But the blue line, that's the linear trend across all those years. You see that upward trend, right, where we've experienced warming. I believe the number was 2 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 50 years. That was in my notes, but I can't see my notes right now. So I can tell you later if you want to ask me about it. But the fact is that we've seen it getting warmer. But what does that mean? One thing that means is that we are seeing far more frost-free days. So the period of time when we have frost on trees, kind of like you're seeing here, has decreased by 16 days on average across the Northwest. And this is important because there's a lot of plant species in particular out there that require frost to procreate, to create their fruits, to create the next generation. That includes a lot of the berry species, fruit trees. So agriculture obviously is a big deal in the state of Washington, and if we don't have enough frost days, that affects the ability to grow apples, pears. It's a huge economic driver for the state, and even more than an economic driver, it's just like a social and political and geographical important thing for a large portion of the state that's being impacted by this change in temperature. Another one here is that spring snowpack has been in decline, and we have seen this trend. The Pacific Northwest, the Olympic Mountains and the Cascades in particular, are seeing a greater degree of decrease in spring snowpack because we have the greatest proportion of warm snow, right? It's kind of a weird thing to hear. What is warm snow? It's considered snow that falls between the temperature range of like 27 to 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So right next to the freezing point. So you can imagine it doesn't take a lot of warming before what had fallen as snow starts just falling as rain, right? And so we're seeing more and more of that. It's across the entire West, and you can see multiple states here, but it's a big deal for the Pacific Northwest, and there'll be some more slides coming up that will spell that out in greater detail. Our glaciers are in decline. I'm sure many of you have seen pictures like this before. I found these pictures just searching on the internet, trying to create my own side-by-side comparison. Again, Banded Glacier on the slopes of Mount Logan and North Cascades National Park. The picture on the left is 1960. On the right, you're looking at 2016. And that's a huge loss. And you can see some of the bullet points here about how severe this loss has been over the course of, 30 to 100 years, depending on which area has been studied. And this is, obviously, it's a big deal if you're a mountaineer and you want to go, hiking up to some of the high peaks, or if you want to get your 4th of July ski run in. But it's not just about recreation, right? That this affects everything downstream. So the salmon in the streams, the orcas that feed on those salmon, hydroelectricity and what that means for our power supply, water resources and whether we're able to feed enough water out for agriculture or for human use, all is affected by this loss of glacier. So I think we've got one more here. So this is not exclusively about heat, but the number of large fires in the area burned in the Northwest has increased over the last 30-ish years. And while that's not only about heat, the heat leads to increased soil aridity, the aridity of fuels, lower relative humidity, and those are all things that just cause that spark to, to turn into a fire instead of just something that, burns out quickly. And I've got some old pictures here, right, of the 2018 burn event that many of you experienced. I wasn't here yet, but we got a repeat last year, right? That from what I've been told was, worse. It lasted longer. So it's not just about literally incinerating the places that we love to go and recreate in. This is affecting public health, right? This is a major deal that we have observed. This is not a projection. It's already happening. Another climate change impact that we see is the acidification of the ocean. I couldn't find a good picture of, like an oyster bed. We don't have corals in the Pacific Northwest. I'm sure you're all aware of that, but I put the picture in there anyway. Really for us, it's more about Dungeness crabs, other shellfish, oysters. They have a really hard time reproducing because when the acidity of the ocean goes up, it becomes harder for them to form shells out of chitin and calcium carbonate. And so when they're babies basically, and they're trying to form that first layer of shell, it just dissolves in the water. And for those of you who don't know, most of the shellfish, the oysters that are now grown in Puget Sound actually have to be nursed, from their infancy in a tank or from, in some other area. And then once they get to a certain age, they can be put out into Puget Sound, so that they actually can't grow naturally in Puget Sound right now. So it's a major impact that we've seen. It's already occurring. Another climate change impact is sea level rise. Globally, the increase that we've seen is ranging from I think it's 4.6 to 6.8 inches, something like that. Again, it's in my notes. Sorry, I don't have it memorized. But in Seattle, it's actually increased 8.6 inches over this time frame you see on the slide here. Now, in the Pacific Northwest, that's complicated because we're in a tectonically active area. So some areas of land are rising, and some of them are rising very quickly. That can mask sea level rise. You sometimes have the land rising even faster than the sea, so it looks like sea level's going down. But basically once the next earthquake hits, and we probably don't, that's like another conversation to have, all of that, hidden sea level rise, if you will come back, and we'll see it. So this is something to be concerned about, even if it doesn't affect all locations across the Pacific Northwest. It's affecting some of them, and it will come home and affect us soon. Well, I hope not, but it may. So here's where I'm going to just take a quick break, because normally we'd be in a room together. I'd be able to ask you to talk to your neighbor. Instead, I just want to ask you to, again, use that chat function if you're comfortable doing so, and say what changes have you noticed? Everything we just talked about, these are scientific observations. They're not projections. There's no complex models here. It's just things that have been experienced, that have been recorded with data. And I'm curious, what have you noticed when you've been out, maybe leading a Mountaineers event or just out on your own? Have there been things that have struck you? And if there have been, why don't you throw them in the chat, and I'll just kind of take a 20 or 30 second pause here to give you a moment to share those thoughts with the other people on the call. And that'll lead to an awkward silence on my part while I'll kind of scratch my chin, give you a little time, and then we'll continue in just a moment. All right, hopefully some of you are sharing some of those ideas. And as you do, continue typing, please. I'm just going to move on to the second set of slides here, or the second set of the scientific piece of this talk, is what's going to happen. What can the science tell us about the future? And projections of climate change are a much more challenging thing to talk about, and we'll look at that for reasons to be discussed here in a moment. So on this chart, just to orient you, the black line here that's going up and down, that was like the purple line in the chart I showed you about the observed warming in the Pacific Northwest, maybe 10 minutes ago. So black is observed. That's why it's just like a solid black line. That's the actual temperatures from year to year. But in order to look into the future, there's a bunch of things that we have to kind of guess about, right? And that includes things like how quickly are developing countries going to develop, and what kind of economies will they develop? How is population growth going to change? What kind of technologies are going to be producing energy in the future? Is it going to be coal dominated or natural gas still? Are we going to sort of switch to nuclear or solar and wind? All those things can lead to big differences in the way the future evolves. And that's what you see here is the red line that's up high. That's a high emission scenario that makes a lot of assumptions about our energy output being higher, there being higher population growth. And the blue is a kind of a lower emission scenario. So instead of talking about reality, we create these scenarios where we can look at different potential futures that might evolve. The important thing to look at here is if you look at what we call mid-century in the climate field, which is around 2050, there's not a huge difference. So here on the low emission scenario, you're looking at about a 4-degree Fahrenheit change in temperature from the industrial baseline, or here I guess it's relative to 1950 to 1999, that average. Now, I'm not going to say that 4 degrees Fahrenheit warming is insignificant. What I'm saying is that if you compare it to the red scenario, the high emission scenario, which is at 5 degrees, the difference between 4 and 5 degrees may be really important, but it's not a huge difference. We wouldn't necessarily adopt different policies because of it. Of course, if you look at all those red lines and blue lines going up and down, those are the individual model runs. The dark red and dark blue lines are the average across models. And what that shows you is that even though the average of models here is saying it's either 4 or 5 degrees, depending upon which emission scenario you choose, you can see that, for the high emission scenario, you're looking at like a 3 to 9 degree warming range. So there's a lot of uncertainty that we have to kind of plan for. And for the low emission scenario, it's lower, but it's still like 2 to 7, right? And that's still a big deal. Like, how do you plan? Like 2 degrees doesn't seem like a big deal. 7 seems pretty severe. But the important thing is to look out towards the end of the century, right? With our low emission scenario, your warming gets up to about 5.5 degrees, which is still going to be a pretty significant issue. But if you look at the high emission scenario, we're looking at 10 degrees Fahrenheit warming. That's a really big deal, and is going to make pretty dramatic changes. And importantly, again, if you look at all those red and blue lines shooting up and down for each of the individual model runs, there you can see that there are models that are projecting up to 15 degree Fahrenheit increases in temperature out in 2100. Now, that's an outlier. It's not likely. That's why we go by the averages, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. So the level of warming is potentially very significant. And then changes in precipitation, right? The other big variable that we have to be concerned about. This graph is the same lines or the same things, right? So the black is our historical precipitation. And so you see how much precipitation varies from year to year with it shooting up and down across that 0 line. The 0 line being right relative to the average. So it's percent change. What we're looking at with the red and the blue lines is that it shows like a slight increase in annual average precipitation, which doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot, right? Because you still get all that variability. But what we do know is that the precipitation trends are going to reinforce current patterns. So we're going to see wetter winters, springs, and falls, and we're going to see drier summers. And that's super important because, as you could probably kind of interpolate from that, a lot of the problems that we have with dryness in the summers, those are potentially going to get much worse, even if we do see more wetness and even more precipitation. If it's falling as rain instead of snow, can lead to flooding and other challenges. So this chart hides a lot of really complicated and interesting data behind it. Projected, sorry, it's kind of hiding my, let's see if I can move this. I cannot. Projected something change in the Northwest. Let's see what it says. Oh, some other changes. So we've already talked about the continued warming. We'll see that 2 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit warming by the 2050s. I'm just running through these quickly due to limited time. Increases in heavy rainfall, even though that average precipitation isn't going to change much, the heaviest rainfall events will get about 20% more intense by the 2080s. It can lead to a lot more flooding. Higher sea levels, we talked about a little bit, but the increases by 2100 range quite a bit, and there's a lot of reasons for that we could talk about, but it could be anywhere from 4 to 56 inches of sea level rise, depending on location and depending on like glacial melt and what's happening to the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. Increasing ocean acidity, it's going to continue acidifying, and it's projected to increase 100 to 150% by 2100. That's going to have increasingly severe effects on our shellfish, our crustaceans, and the ocean life that depends upon that entire food web. And all of that is layered on top of our ongoing natural variability, right? So when you have a very hot year, but your baseline is sort of normal, that hot year is a challenge. But when you've increased your temperature significantly and then you have a hot year, right, that's going to cause even bigger problems. Right, so I like this series of charts. This is a moment, you can kind of think like, this shows you April 1st snow water equivalent is basically, it's a metric that's used to show how much precipitation, it's whether you're going to be in drought or not, right? Like if you have a lot of snow on the ground on April 1st, we probably are in a good place. And if you don't, we're probably going to be seeing some drought conditions. And this just shows you, you can see the Olympic Mountains and the Cascades going up and down. It's exactly where you would expect to see precipitation. And where do you think warming temperatures are most likely to reduce that snowpack? I'll give you a second to kind of answer on your own, but it ends up being right further south in latitude and lower in elevation. That's where it warms the quickest, and that's what we'll see over the next few slides. So here are projections of what this change is going to look like over time. The bright yellows are not a lot of loss. I mean, you start seeing the oranges, reds, and the deep dark reds. You're starting to see, the absence of snowpack. And so as you go through these slides, you start seeing, right, I'll go back through them a few times. By the end of these projections, we're seeing areas where that used to be, used to have a lot of snowpack are going to be snow-free in the future. That's going to have a significant impact on our ecosystems, the recreation we like to do, many other things. Here's another way of looking at it. This is a hydrograph that shows you sort of the typical pattern of stream flow. What you see, in October, the fall rains start and the stream flow goes up as it's raining. Then you start hitting like December and that rain starts to fall as snow. And so stream flow goes down because the snow is falling and it's sticking on the ground, right? And then you hit like sort of the March to April timeframe, and a lot of that snow starts to melt, and so you get that big peak, as it's melting and rain is still falling, typically peaking out sort of in May, June, and then that dramatic drop that we all experience when the summer comes along. It gets super dry, gets super beautiful, but we're not seeing a lot of rain in the summer here. As we see things warm, we get a few things going on here. One is that we'll get more winter rain, that intensification of the winter precipitation patterns. That's the blue arrow. The green arrow will get an earlier peak, right? Because snow is going to melt earlier in the season, what snow is there. And because there will overall be less snow and there's less snow melt, you'll see the summer flow will be going down. And we can see this here with some emission scenarios. The blue dashed line shows you a projection of what it's going to look like in the 2020s, in the 2040s. And by the time you get to the 2080s with a medium emission scenario, what that black line shows you is a typical snow-dominated hydrograph. And what the red dashed line shows you is a typical rain-dominated watershed where nothing sticks around as snow. And so you get your peak actually in the winter. That's where your peak stream flow is. You can think through the ways that this is going to cause problems, and there's so many, but the one that probably comes to mind for most people is, what does that mean for the salmon, right? They tend to migrate upstream in the summer, and we're going to have even lower flows than we have now. This is going to be a serious problem for salmon, in addition to everything else that's reliant upon snow, from agriculture to wolverines to going skiing, right? All of these things are affected by this. And I'm a little light on time, so I might go through this pretty quickly. It shows the same thing. Green are rain-dominated watersheds, blue are snow-dominated watersheds, and the red are like a rain-snow mix. And what you see over time is basically the green area will grow and the blue area will shrink away. And so as we go through these, right, we get to this point where if you start here in the historical, you can see in the Cascades, there's a lot of snow-dominated watersheds along the Cascades there. But as we progress to the 2020s, it's fewer watersheds, even fewer in the 2040s. By the 2080s, there's no snow-dominated watersheds in the Cascades. They're that mixed rain snow. So it's kind of the same story, but giving you a different perspective on it. So what does this mean to you? This was another spot where I was going to ask you to take a moment and kind of share your thoughts. It can be hard to process a lot of this stuff. I know, you know, like there's a lot of fear and concern and despair around the kinds of things I'm talking about now. So instead of asking you to share your despair, I think I'll move to the next slide, which is, what do you do about it, right? Thanks for the thoroughly depressing talk. Do you have any good news? And I'll remind you that this is not the answer, right? I don't want you to stick your head in the sand. And I've got a bunch of reasons why I think that this is the wrong answer, and let's get into them. So what can we do? There's two main ways that climate nerds like me talk about how we respond to climate change. One is mitigation. That's reducing your emissions of greenhouse gases, whether it's your power source or driving less, you know, consuming less, what have you. But you don't want to forget about adaptation, right? Some change is already baked into the system, and we need to be able to identify, prepare for, and manage the change. Then who's going to do it? This is an important issue to consider. And this, I borrowed this from Stephen Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. For those of you who know that book, he talks about this concept of having a circle of concern, things that you care about but can't necessarily do much about. Your circle of influence, where you actually have some agency. And then this is my modification, but it's your area of control, like the things that you can choose to do. So you might be concerned about what the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change or the Conference of the Parties is doing about climate change, but pretty much every moment you spend thinking about that is not going to change the outcome of the Conference of Parties negotiations, right? That's, I mean, for those of you that can affect that, go for it. Like I wish you the best. You also might be concerned about what is the U.S. government doing, right? Like we switched parties, we switched presidential administrations, climate policy changed dramatically. And I'm sure we all care about that to some degree, but how much can we each individually influence that? It's generally pretty low. Again, for the exceptions out there, go for it, I'm on your side. You know, even the state of Washington, where, you know, we can vote and, you know, choose our governor and our elected representatives. And hopefully we're all excited about the Climate Commitment Act that was recently passed, not yet signed into law by the governor, but hopefully will be soon. Still an area where we might be concerned, but can't do a whole lot. And of course, you know, what are all the Fortune 500 companies doing out there? We have almost no control over that. But in terms of influence, you know, what about your city? If you live in the city of Seattle or the city of Tacoma, you may very well know your mayor or your council members. You've probably voted for them. They're much more likely to listen to you. If you want your local community to take action, that's a place where you can make a difference. Or the Mountaineers, here you are. And, you know, Betsy Robley wants to know what you have to say, and she's listening right now. So type away in the chat things that you think you need to do. But ultimately, I think we should talk right now about that sphere of control. What is it that you can do? So let's do that really quickly. And I'm going to start with a little bit of the science, right? How much do we need to do? I found this study in preparing for this talk the first time around that I gave it before I've adapted it to now. And it shows you your high impact opportunities for reducing your greenhouse gas footprint, right? Those are all the green things. So if you look at some of them, boom, live car free. Not many people can do that, but it has a huge impact. Avoid one transatlantic flight, right? This is one that we don't necessarily want to hear about because, man, there's some great adventures to be had if we cross, you know, continents and go to distant, beautiful places. Buying a more efficient car, you know, that's maybe a more palatable option for a lot of people, and it's still pretty significant. You know, the plant-based diet, eating no meat at all, has a pretty significant effect. But some of the things that we're always taught to do, you know, like recycling, it's not insignificant, but its impact is far less than some of these other changes that are in green. And some of them, like upgrading light bulbs, which is something I'm sure we've all done, right? We've heard a lot about it. has a very low impact. It doesn't make a huge difference. But the reality is, right, that people have done the science to figure out what do we need to do to sort of limit ourselves to 2 degrees of warming globally. And they've calculated that we need a global average per capita carbon budget of 2.1 tons of carbon dioxide per year, per person across the world, right? And where is that? That's this red line right here. So if you take 1 transatlantic flight, you're already almost at that cap, right? And that's just like a tough reality to tackle with. But where is the United States at today? We currently have a per capita emissions of 16.5 tons of carbon dioxide per year. So boom, way off the chart if you go by the lower, like it kind of goes nonlinear on you at the upper half, but if you go by the 0 to 4 part of it, we're really high. And our job is to get back down to here. And to do that, we really need to take an all of the above kind of approach. Let's do a lot of different things. I'm realizing now that I don't have a ton of time. So here's a couple quotes. I'll let you read them, but one thing that a lot of us probably suffer from is the gear junkie habit, right? Like getting the newest, nicest gear. And I was thinking about that as I was putting this talk together and did a couple of web searches. And you go to REI and outside you is always cool. Like I want to buy something. I want to be cool, right? Black Diamond, man, that looks like a beautiful place to be. And all my backpacks are pretty messed up compared to theirs, but there's just this endless desire to like get that new piece of gear that we got to be thoughtful about. This advertisement from Solomon, I love this one because, get ready to power through uphills and descents with the all new X Ultra 4 GTX. The new ADVC chassis targets articulations on the outer foot to optimize stability without limiting your mobility. Sounds like you're going to go to the moon. I want a pair of shoes like that, right? But then I went over to Patagonia and this is what I saw. We the power, the future of the energy is community owned. What does that have to do with buying stuff? Right? So I dug a little deeper on their website. I clicked that activism tab. We're in business to save our home planet. Like this is cool. This is a company that's really trying to do something different. And when you click on the shop button, you have an opportunity to click on used gear. They're trying to sell used gear now, which takes you to this other website, Warrenware, explaining to you why it's cool to buy used gear, right? And this isn't a big market yet. I'm not saying it's displacing outdoor gear manufacturing, but it's just an awareness that our daily habits, right, and the things we do for recreation have an impact, and we should be aware of that. Let me see. So then I figured, the other thing we could talk about here, and I wanted to do a little experiment on myself for the benefit of all of us, is the idea of carbon credits, right? So I'm a passionate mountain biker, and I can't imagine not doing it. I live in Seattle. To get to mountain biking, boom, I got to drive. So I just picked my kids' elementary school and picked a typical trailhead that I drive to and did some calculations. So boom, you can do the math if you want, but I calculated how many miles per year I'm driving just to go mountain biking for no other reason, right? How much carbon am I putting out there, right? Almost 5,000 pounds of carbon per year just to go mountain biking. 2.17 tons of CO2 in 2020. That's my sort of ballpark calculation. But here's the thing: when I then went and looked at the carbon markets and how much a ton of carbon a carbon credit sells for, $20.81. My entire year's worth of my mountain biking habit could be offset for a grand total of $45.08. Right? That's somewhere between the cost of buying a chain for that bike and buying a tire for that bike. If we would all start including that kind of a expense as part of what we do when we go out and recreate, I'm not saying it's the solution, but I think it's a step in the right direction to start living our lives in the way that we're acknowledging that the impact that we have is important and that we should try and deal with it. I'm going to skip a couple slides here in the interest of time. What can you do? Who's going to do it? So here's where I wanted to talk a little bit about the Mountaineers and I think some opportunities that you all have. And first, it's this communications conundrum that I wanted to point out for you. A lot of science has been done in the past decade or so on the communication of climate change and how people receive that information. And here's some of the things they discovered. 69% of Americans think it's happening. 62% of Americans are kind of worried about it. 64 say it's like important to them at some level. That's how they feel about things. What are they doing? 63% of Americans rarely or never discuss it with family or friends. 51% hear about it from the media at least once a month, but only 23% hear it from people that they know. So what struck me here is about 2/3 of Americans think it's happening, think it's important, they care about it, it worries them. But 2/3 of Americans also rarely or never discuss it. There's something that's not going on there. Like, why aren't we talking about something that we're so concerned about? And I think this is like a key to one important role that we can each play individually. I'm playing it with you right now, right? But that as volunteers that might be leading events with the Mountaineers, or the Mountaineers reaching out to a broader community, normalizing these conversations and talking about these things, so they're not problematic, and people can hear what you're saying, can be really important. And this is the best advice I've heard about how to turn climate concern into climate action is from a Professor Ed Maibach. And it's this 3-part recipe. You need simple, clear messages that are repeated often or by a variety of trusted sources. I believe the Mountaineers is one of those trusted sources. There's a bunch of others, but it has to be repeated often by a variety of trusted sources. So maybe the Mountaineers can be one of those trusted sources. So when I came up with that idea, I figured, I shouldn't just tell you to do it. I should run an experiment. So I threw, this was almost, I guess, a year and a half ago now that I did this, but I threw out a Facebook post just saying, like, I've never done this before. I'm just going to post something online. I'm going to lob it into the blogosphere or whatever and just see what happens, right? And I work on climate change, but I don't talk about it that much. Why is that, right? So I posted about it. The thing I wanted to point out here, I mean, I don't have a large Facebook following, right? But this is like one of the most shared posts I've ever put up. But what was more interesting than that is the responses I got. You can see a few here. Like, this is one of my childhood friends who I don't talk to much anymore, but he's, basically says he's right, and I'm going to decide not to eat meat because of this post. I was like blown away. There's another friend who's, kind of amplified my point and then said, this week I decided to not drive to go skiing. I took the bus instead. And at this point I was like, oh, the gauntlet's thrown. I better have some sort of a response to this, right? So then I posted again, and I said, thanks for throwing the gauntlet. And in response, I bought my first carbon credit ever. And then I swore off Justin's peanut butter, and decided to get the kind you gotta, mix up with that knife, and it's super annoying, but it doesn't have any palm oil in it, right? And palm oil is a huge cause of deforestation. So, these are the little things that we can do, but it's not about like me changing peanut butter is what made the difference. It was me posting about it, and then it started this conversation where, again, the most commented post in my very narrow social media life. But it started a really significant conversation where a lot of people joined in to kind of talk about, what does this mean? And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, where you as individuals and the Mountaineers as a group could actually make a huge difference. The other thing I wanted to point out was this idea of carbon credits and what you can do there. So I was recently invited to a family reunion with my in-laws where I had to buy 4 plane tickets to San Diego. And I figured, hey, let's figure out what the carbon credits are for that. I went to this organization, cooleffect.org. It's a real easy way to buy carbon credits if any of you want to do it. I did a lot of research. This place is great. It's verified by the right organizations, and it's an easy interface to use. But it was like less than $50 for 4 plane tickets from Seattle to San Diego. And then I figured, let's talk to the family about it, right? This is nuts. You're not supposed to talk about politics, religion, right? All the important stuff you're not supposed to talk about with your family, especially your in-laws. So I had my son write this instead, actually. So this is what my son wrote. And it was really cool, right? I typed it for him, but this is what he said. And so I was really excited that he was able to articulate that flying's not good for the planet, and we wanted to do this and help. In this case, we picked a project where it's efficient cook stoves in Africa. And then, I followed up with my own little thing, like, hey, it's Earth Day, and, don't hate us because we're the weirdo relatives that care about the Earth. And the cool thing was, like, my mother-in-law was just like, oh, that's really cool. That didn't give me much. But my brother-in-law actually went, checked it out, watched the video about the project in Africa, and bought credits for his trip too, right? So sometimes just talking about this changes people's behavior. And I think that's a really powerful statement about why we need to engage in this more often. Okay, I'm seeing that I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to skip that. The Mountaineers do. I think maybe we'll just skip to the end because I want to leave at least a couple minutes for questions. Up in the upper left there, that's Betsy Robley's email. Please email her with your thoughts about what the Mountaineers can do. You've got my email address there. Feel free to reach out to me. But at this point, I would just open it up to questions, knowing we don't have a lot of time, but I'm happy to stay over a little bit if folks do have questions. Sorry for the abrupt end there. I just noticed I was over time.
This is Natalie again, chiming in, and I've been monitoring the chat, looking at some questions that people have put in. There's been a lot coming through and a lot of response to the questions that you asked about people discussing climate change, how often they did so. I'm just going to go back through a couple of things. People talked about, a person named Jared wrote, it seems these rarely develop into a full discussion, unfortunately, although people bring it up with some frequency. And so I was thinking a lot about the awkwardness of talking about climate change when we don't necessarily have all the facts at hand. Sometimes when you get into a long discussion, it quickly dwindles into guessing. And so having you here to talk about this gives us some talking points, and I think that's helpful. So that's something that people were talking about in the chat.
Can I respond to that one really quick?
Yeah.
So I think that's a really important point because I find myself getting sucked into that a lot too. And it's always with the wrong people. And there's some studies like the communication studies that I pointed out that talk about like who's receptive to facts, like with whom does talking about facts actually make a difference. But what they actually discovered in all this communications research is that you're going to make the biggest difference by leading with your values. Right? What's important to you? Like your friends care about who you are as a person and the things that you care about, they're more likely to care about. And the more of us that say what my son said, right? Like flying hurts the planet, but we love you too much to not come see you. So we're going to buy this, this carbon credit, right? That has way more impact on my mother-in-law than telling her the facts about climate change. So I'm not saying the facts don't matter. I'm in the world of facts. I'm working with the research, but values and personal relationships are even more important when it comes to communicating about climate change.
I'm noticing a lot of other comments in the chat. I wanted to go to a couple points that people were making, and I think they're related to what you're talking about. Early, about halfway through your chat, a person named Daphne wrote, do you have any, or do we know of any citizen science projects we could take part in that that might be helpful to, what can we do about it? Can you recommend anything like that, or?
I wish that there was easier access to those kinds of opportunities. I attended a talk, it was over a year ago now, but it was a professor at UW who I think had engaged the citizens around Lake Sammamish to do a lot of lake vegetation and temperature, like data collection and sampling species and looking for invasives. And it just struck me how powerful that is to get sort of everyday people involved in the collection of scientific data, and they get to feel like they make a difference. But I'm honestly not aware of any sort of a clearinghouse for those opportunities, which would be, I think the ideal thing would be like, here's the UW site you go to get connected with researchers who are looking for that. So I think it is really, unfortunately, more spontaneous and sort of personal connections. But I can ask my colleagues and see if I can come up with a better answer than that one, because that's an unsatisfying answer to me.
Yeah, thanks. Because that is a way to get involved. Other things, I'm also thinking about I'm looking through the chat. You asked what people were noticing in their everyday lives that signaled climate change, and people were right in line with what you were saying about like concentrated rainfall, but people are also saying like concentrated sun, like it feels like the sun is actually beaming down more hotly. Rhododendrons blooming in December and January. So 70-degree weeks in April that we just went through. Glacial recession in my adult life and not just my whole life. And also shifts in plant and animal diversity and patterns of distribution. I thought of, when someone wrote that, I thought of like the California scrub jays that didn't used to be here and are all over the place now, things like that. So those were a few things that were in line with what you were talking about, but also kind of adding to the examples you were already giving us.
Right, and a lot of those observations are supported by the science as well, right? That when, if you wanted to dig into the literature and really see, what has been the trend in, the range of certain species over time, that those studies have often been done, but there is a lot of power in personal experience, right? And in speaking to that, you always have to be a little careful, right? Because anecdotal experience is always somebody that's going to be on the opposite side. He's like, well, I've never, it often comes down to like, you have a particularly cold winter, like, so what happened with global warming? It's really cold this year. So the anecdotal experience can be kind of a double-edged sword, but when you see patterns year after year after year, like declining snowpack, fewer powder days, to skiers, that's a big deal, or earlier bloom dates. There's a lot of evidence behind bloom dates moving earlier in the season and spring kicking off sooner. And that's actually a huge problem because the species interact in really important ways where, some species that are migrating from other locations need some of those, bloom dates, like that's their food. And if it's happening 2 weeks earlier than when they're migrating through and their food source is not present, that can affect their ability to survive, right? So it's not just like, oh, the flowers are happening earlier. That's going to cascade through the ecosystem.
Yeah. This is not exactly on the same thread, but recreation and conservation. Early in your talk, James asked, how long will we be able to ski at Snoqualmie Pass? And so based on the slides that you showed, maybe that will move us to act.
No, I had I had these facts closer to mind about a year ago, but I talked to an economist, I think a recreation economist, there are apparently such things, who told me that I think it was for a ski resort to be economically viable, it had to have right around 60 operational days. And so you could actually figure out when a ski resort would no longer be viable based on that date. Like if you didn't have 60 days of skiable terrain, you just wouldn't be able to make the economics work. And it doesn't look good for Snoqualmie. I mean, Snoqualmie does have this really unique microclimate that I'm sure you've all noticed it, right? Like you drive over the pass, there's a ton of snow at the pass, and you drive down the other side and you get to like Lake Cochise and it's, there's nothing on the ground, or it's just like a thin layer. So maybe it'll survive there because all that moisture funnels up from everything below and it dumps out right there before it drops back down on the east side of the Cascades. But yeah, I think that we probably need to be concerned that that the economics of the summit at Snoqualmie has a limited lifespan. They might be able to survive by diversifying their resort economics, right? And they're doing that. They're opening up a mountain bike park for summer recreation, and that might allow them to continue to do winter recreation as well. But now we're talking about adaptation, right? Like climate change is happening. It's going to affect how a ski resort can operate. Instead of giving up, which was one option, the owners of the summit at Snoqualmie decided to diversify the economics of their resort so that they can remain viable and be open because they have more than one kind of recreation coming through that area now. So not the best answer if you're a snow lover, right? Like, oh, great, the mountain bikers are there, but that doesn't help me because I'd rather be on powder. But hopefully they'll still be able to be open for the fewer days of good snow that will be there. And it's really hard to say that after this last year because Alpental was hammered. I mean, I didn't get to go up that often, but I know that I had a lot of friends that just thought it was the best skier of their life. So hopefully we get more of those too.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to invite people, if there's maybe one or two questions to put in the chat. We have a couple more minutes to go. And so if there's anybody with a question out there, there was a bit of a discussion of carbon offsets in the chat because it's a controversial subject. Yeah. Betsy posted a blog post from from the Carbon Footprint Reduction Committee on Offsets, so people can click on that and read what Mountaineers has blogged about in carbon credits. But I will say that I'm not seeing necessarily a question so much, I guess the question is like, how realistic is the cost for carbon credits? What are they exactly? And how can we kind of navigate the complexity of this? Because this is something I know you're a believer in carbon offsets.
Yeah, and I wasn't always, to be clear. I used to think carbon offsets were the equivalent of buying an indulgence from the Pope. For those of you that know your ancient, kind of European history.
One person said that.
Oh yeah. Okay. So I think it's an apt comparison. You're still sinning, right? But you're just, kind of buying your way out of it. And that has some like justice and equity implications as well that I think are important to recognize. But to me, the most important thing at this moment in time is that we move from inaction to some kind of action, right? We have to make some kind of progress. And if what we tell people today is you just can't fly to go on vacation ever again, right? If that's the answer, they're going to be like, head back in the sand. I don't want to hear that. That's too much. You're an extremist. I can't, my daughter lives in, and this isn't me, but like somebody's gonna be like, my daughter lives in Australia and I want to visit her, right? So you got to find a way around it in the meantime, and then we've got to search for other solutions. And what I would encourage you to do is go to not just cooleffect.org. I just picked that one, but if you look at some of these organizations, they will show you exactly what projects they're funding with your money if you give them their money. And they'll show you, just like every good nonprofit, what percentage of what you give them is going to those projects and what percentage is going to overhead and staff costs and marketing and all of that. And when I looked at what Cool Effect was doing, it was really compelling. And I should also note that locally, King County is starting to try and do its own carbon offset program just for King County, where the offsets would be the preservation of local forests. So this would be an opportunity not to, like, for some people, funding cook stoves in Africa is going to be compelling. And for others, it's like, well, whatever, that's like so far away. I care about the natural environment here in the Pacific Northwest. And that's what King County is trying to do. And if you search like King County carbon offsets on Google, I'm sure you'll find it. But they have a cool little video that describes what they're trying to do. And it's basically creating an opportunity to, it's either reforest logged lands differently and or delaying how frequently those lands are harvested for timber to basically to increase the amount of carbon that's pulled out of the atmosphere. So it's very specific what they're doing, and I think it's worth asking hard questions, and it's worth being skeptical. It always is in all aspects of your life, right? But at a certain point, you also just have to take the best option available to you. And if what you're doing is flying, I mean, if you're riding your bike everywhere you go and you don't fly at all, I mean, kudos to you, right? I feel like that's an important statement to make, and I think that we should all aspire to get as close to that ideal as possible. But for those of us who have family that's far away and we're going to go visit them anyway, instead of just ignoring that you have an impact, I think paying for it is a good step in the right direction.
Yeah, thank you. And there are a few more comments kind of coming through about carbon balance and carbon offsets in the chat. So yeah, I think I was reminded of the target that you showed us about the 7 habits of highly effective people and the things that we can control, actually, that maybe we're, well, depending on how we feel about those things, but we might be able to find out a lot more about PSE or King County or Pierce County or Kitsap more readily than we can find out about, is that program in Namibia really getting their money? So those kinds of questions that you're bringing up.
Yeah.
I think we're at about time. I'm waiting to see if there's any last minute questions in the chat, but I think we're about ready to wrap up. We had promised to conclude at about 8:10, and it's right at 8:09. Any last little remarks, or Wade, do you like to wrap up, or shall we call it a night?
Oh, for me?
Yeah.
You know, my final thoughts are I'm super excited that people who are part of a recreation community are starting to ask these kinds of questions, right? I think that for too long, at my personal journey for too long, even though I worked professionally in climate change, my recreation life was almost separate, right? I was flying to Spain for a mountain biking vacation. Then I went to Switzerland for a mountain biking vacation. Then I went to Peru for a mountain biking vacation. And I was working on climate change that entire time. And I failed to put two and two together because I wasn't asking hard questions about, you know, what am I doing and what kind of an example am I setting for myself, for my kids, for the people I work with. And until some of us start asking the kinds of questions that you all are asking right now, including, you know, like, is our carbon credits really worth it? Until we ask those questions, we're not doing anything, right? And so I'm just encouraged that we're asking those questions and we're having these conversations. So thank you for joining this talk, and thank you to the Mountaineers for hosting the series of talks on this topic. And I hope you continue to stay engaged and see what you can do in your personal life, but also through the Mountaineers or through, you know, other avenues that you got. So I'm just staying positive and feeling, you know, a lot of gratitude that you're all here, and I think you're all part of the solution.
Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you everybody for attending. Hopefully we can put together some more climate change speaker series or another series to answer more of these questions and keep this conversation going in the future. So good night, everyone. Thanks again.
Good night, everyone. Thanks, Natalie. Thanks, Betsy.
Thanks, Betsy. Thanks, Jason. Bye.